Do you want your sermons to make more of an impact week after week? Do you want people to engage with your sermons, to be more enthralled with your sermons, more attentive? Do you just want people to stay awake through the course of your service? Well, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how you can not only keep them awake and not only get them to be more attentive to what you're doing on a Sunday morning preaching, but what you can do to increase their understanding of the Bible, their perspective on Scripture, go deeper in their relationship with Jesus just by doing this one thing to your sermon. That's what we're going to talk about today. So let's get started. So the big question is this: how do pastors like us who remain focused on the mission of Jesus and serving our communities without being distracted by everything in the world around us, how do we increase our effectiveness while living a lifestyle that doesn't compromise our health, our families, or our personal relationships with Jesus? That's the question this podcast is going to answer. I'm Dr. Brandon Party Cooper, and welcome to the Ministry Hackers Podcast. Welcome to this episode of the Ministry Hackers Podcast. I hope you're doing wonderfully wherever you are and whatever it is you are doing. Our goal here at Ministry Hackers is to help you live your dream life, pastor your growing church, growing ministry, while at the same time having margin in your time and margin in your money to enjoy your family, your friends, to have a hobby, to go travel. Do whatever it is that God has called you to do, whatever it is that you enjoy doing, whatever it is that gives you a fulfilled life and a healthy lifestyle. So that's what our goal is, and I'm so glad that you're here with us, part of this podcast, part of this community, and joining with us today. So what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about how you can engage people more with your sermons. Now, we've been talking over the last couple of weeks about the problem of biblical illiteracy. And we've been talking about how it's just a growing problem, not in our nation, although it is. It's a growing problem within our churches, within our Christian communities. People don't know their Bibles. Now, there's a whole conversation with discipleship and how we disciple and what the best methods are. And there are other episodes that we can talk about, or other episodes you can tune in on and listen to where we talk about that. But what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks is how you can strengthen people's knowledge and understanding of the Bible and of Scripture simply through your sermons on a Sunday morning. We talked about in a previous episode how expository preaching is one of the key ways to get people to know more about the Bible instead of topical sermons. Instead of a steady diet of topical sermons where you're taking a topic, you're pulling all these random pieces of Scripture together to undergird that topic. Instead, doing an expository sermon where you are preaching a chunk of Scripture. Maybe it's a whole chapter, maybe it's a story, maybe it's just a selection of passages, but you're preaching a chunk of Scripture, and that is really the focus of the sermon. So that's one way, that's one piece, one thing you can do in your Sunday morning sermons to increase people's knowledge and understanding of the Bible. However, one of the things that we didn't talk about in that episode, and what I want to really touch on today, is you can have a great expository sermon. You can have technically a sermon that really brings a lot of Scripture, that really goes deep into the culture and deep into the backstory and deep into the characters, and you can have that. But if they're not staying awake through your 20, 30, 40, 60-minute sermon, it doesn't matter how much information you're giving them. If they're sleeping or nodding off or on their phones playing whatever popular game is out there at the time, well, then it's not really going to have the effect you're wanting it to have. And so what I want to talk about today is, we've talked about how to do expository sermons and how effective those can be. But now I want to talk today about how you can make your sermons more engaging. So when people walk in, they're excited, they're anticipating, they're walking in ready to hear the word, ready to hear your sermon, ready to hear what you're bringing to the table that day. And then when they walk out, they just keep milling it over and they keep thinking about it, and they're super excited, and they say, that was such a good sermon that Pastor preached this morning. And then on Wednesday, they're saying, man, that was such a good sermon. I'm still thinking about it, still processing through it. Because I don't know about you, but in my own experience, a lot of people have forgotten my sermons by the time they've hit the lunch table. And that says that they weren't really engaged, they weren't really bought in, and they weren't really a part of what we were doing that morning. And so what I want to do is I want to show you exactly how you can make your sermons more engaging, keep people's attention so all that great biblical knowledge that you're giving them sinks in and is a part of their understanding of their knowledge base of Scripture itself. Okay, but first let's define what an engaging sermon is. What does an engaging sermon look like? And the first thing that I think that an engaging sermon is it's emotive, which means that it inspires emotion in the congregation. Now, this could be joy and happiness. You could be funny, really kind of getting them to laugh and getting them to maybe nod along with you and rib their neighbor because of the humor that you're bringing in. It could be that. It could be this almost this frustration with the way things are, or frustration with maybe how they're living their life, or frustration with they keep doing the same thing and getting the same result, and they're frustrated with that, and it pushes them towards action. It could be sorrow. It could be compassion. I know for me, a lot of times when missionaries have come in town and they've shared their stories, and they've shared the things that are happening on the field and the people that they're touching. I know for me, there's this emotion that comes out of me, this like broken heart, compassion for those people, compassion for what they're going through, compassion for the challenges and difficulties that they're facing. What you want your sermon to do is you want to move people emotionally. Emotion is tied to action. And so if people are not being moved emotionally one way or the other, whether it's joy, happiness, frustration, compassion, hurt, whatever, if there's not some level of emotional engagement, then usually there's no action afterwards, because we usually don't make decisions based on cognitive information, understanding what we think. I've heard it said before that we make decisions based on emotion, and then we justify it with logic and information. And so I think when we're preaching our sermons, we're giving our sermons, if we are not engaging people's emotions, then we can't be frustrated that they're not taking action, because emotion is the precursor to most of the actions we do in our lives. So that's the first thing. It has to be emotive. The second thing is it has to be interesting. Now, if you're doing a expository sermon, the beauty of expository sermons is there's really, really cool information that's involved when you're preaching an expository sermon. There's backstories, and there's ties to other portions of Scripture. There's usually some sort of narrative that you can pull from. There's characters that are involved that you can pull from their life and what we know of them, or the thought process they're going through. Maybe you're adding in statistics to your sermon, or you're sharing a testimony of your own life or somebody else's life. But it's got to be interesting. It has to be something where people are looking for the next thing, where they're you're talking about this and they're kind of looking to see where it goes. It has to grab their attention and keep them just interested, because if they're not interested, then they'll find something else to be interested in. Usually they pull out their phones, they start looking on Facebook, or they start checking their fantasy scores, or whatever the case may be, because it's not engaging them. It's not interesting to them. And so, your sermons have to be interesting, and your congregation, what they're interested in. So, if you have a congregation that's not very interested in data and facts and those types of things, well, don't share things like that unless there's a good impact. But if you're in a community where, you have people that, they love data and stats, and that's just kind of how that community is, we'll use those things. Or maybe you have a community that's really narrative oriented. They love stories. They love a good story. They go to the theater a lot, or, they go to plays, or whatever the case is. Use that. Know your congregation and know the things that they're interested in, so you can weave that into your sermons and keep them interested. So engaging sermons are emotive. They're interesting. They're also thought-provoking. Now, I think this is hard sometimes for us, because as pastors and ministry leaders, we kind of walk this line of, we don't want to offend anybody, really. But at the same time, we also want to kind of push the envelope a little bit. Now, some of us just jump right over that line and, we say things that are offensive, or we say things that we feel like are controversial. And if that works for your congregation, then great. But usually that's too much. It's too far. And that's not what we're going for. What we're wanting to do is we're wanting to move them maybe 2 or 3 steps from where they are today. So, hey, you think this, and Jesus was great at this. You've been told this. Well, I'm here to tell you that. Well, what happens is you're not blowing them out of the water. You're moving them slightly 2 or 3 steps away from where they are. And you're expecting them to think about it. So you think this, but I'm here to tell you this. And it causes them to say, it makes sense. I think I agree with that, but I'm not sure. If it's thought-provoking, it grabs them, it holds them, and sometimes holds them for days, even weeks, because there's this something there that they just can't quite make out for themselves. Not that it's not clear. You've been clear, but it's pushing them to think beyond what they know, or beyond what they believe, or beyond the rut that they found themselves in. Make it thought-provoking, giving facts, giving information, giving insight, giving maybe a slightly different perspective or angle on something. Make it thought-provoking and force your congregation, those paying attention, those who are involved, those who are engaged, force them to have to wrestle with what you just said. We want to make everything super clear, and I think that there is value in that to a point. But if we really want to give them something to grow deeper with Scripture, really to challenge them, we have to be thought-provoking. And so we want it to be emotive, we want it to be interesting, we want it to be thought-provoking, and then finally, we want to stimulate their senses. Now, I learned this when I did theater in college. The more senses you can engage, the more people are involved in the experience. And so when we do plays, when we do theater, we try to do what we can to engage all 5 senses. Now, we can't always do that, but we do what we can to engage as many as possible, because every sense is another layer to the experience, and every layer to the experience draws us in further. So if you're standing at a pulpit with the stage and the background the way it is every week, and you're dressed in a different outfit than you were last week, the only real visual sense that's being engaged is you in a different outfit. And people tune that out pretty quickly because your outfit doesn't really matter to their experience in the sermon. If you're giving visuals, though, if you're giving pictures, if you're giving different lighting based on what's going on in the sermon, if you're, if you can somehow infuse a scent or a smell into the room at a different point, or maybe, one thing that we do at Christmas time, we give candy canes. Sometimes we give them just to kids. Sometimes we give them to everybody. But by doing that, that sense of taste then engages them further into what we're doing. So make your sermons some way stimulate the senses. And I know that sometimes that can get complicated, and even sometimes that can cost more. But quite honestly, most of the time we can do different sounds, we can do different visuals, and not really cost a lot or add a lot of work. Touch is a harder one to engage with an entire congregation. Smell, obviously there are things you can do with smell. Taste, sometimes you can do those. Those 3 are a little bit harder. But creating different lighting, different visuals, creating different noises in the room. I've done sermons where I've had background music that changes throughout the sermon. Finding ways to really stimulate the senses, to draw them in, to make them feel like they're a part of an experience more than just a passive listener to your sermon. So that's what engaging sermons are. They're emotive, they're interesting, they're thought-provoking, and they stimulate the senses. So let me give you 4 ways that you can make your sermons more engaging. And the first one is draw attention. Draw attention. Now, this goes back to the senses and all of that, but draw attention. What are you doing to draw the attention? One of the things that I've done several times is I start a sermon from somewhere else in the room. And so, whatever the situation is, the last church I was in, we did announcements. So we would do worship, and then we would close out the worship, and then we'd go into a video announcement. So the announcements were up on the wall, the lights were all down. And then as the announcement finished up, then whoever was preaching would then take over. Well, usually what we would do is we would go up on the stage behind the pulpit. The announcements would go down, lights would come up, and then we go into a sermon. But one of the things that I like to do is I like to be somewhere else in the room. So when the lights go down the video goes down, lights come up, I'm not up there. Because immediately what people says is, whoa, something's not right. Something's wrong. Where'd pastor go? But what it does is it draws them in. It draws their attention to the fact that nobody is up on the stage and they think that something is wrong. And then the next thing that they experience is my voice in the room. And usually it's not, hey, good morning, guys, whatever. Usually it's some sort of dramatic element. I go into some sort of story, but I just start talking. And what it does is it forces them to look around the room and figure out, well, where's the voice coming from? Where's pastor at? Well, what I've done is I've drawn their attention into the intro of the sermon. And usually, again, it's some sort of story based on the passage of scripture that I'm preaching from. I'm telling them a story. I'm giving them background. I'm setting a scene or setting a moment for them. I'm creating an atmosphere that draws their attention into that moment. So an engaging sermon draws attention. Maybe it's not the intro. Maybe at some point in the service, you're going and you're preaching and you really want to drive this point home. And we've all done this at some point. We are preaching and we really want to drive a point home. And so we stop and we create this dead space that everybody kind of then like perks up. Like everybody on their phone, they realize there's nothing to listen to anymore. And they're like, what's going on? It draws their attention. And then we make the point that we're trying to make. So an engaging sermon draws attention. And that's what we're wanting to do. We're wanting to draw attention. The second thing we want to do is we want to have a dynamic delivery. Now, I don't know necessarily how other denominations or church fellowships around the country do this. I know for me, as a Pentecostal preacher, I have grown up with this idea that a dynamic delivery is really just kind of yelling. Like we get really loud and we yell. And quite honestly, for me, that didn't work because I'm not a yeller. I'm not a loud person necessarily. I even questioned myself for a long time about, as a preacher, could I be a preacher? Because I'm not yelling, screaming, hollering. That's not me. That's not how I approach it. But what I've learned is that I can have a dynamic delivery without yelling. Now, are there times where I raise my voice? Absolutely. Very strategic moments. Will I raise my voice and lower my voice for effect? Yes. But how do you deliver? Do you deliver your sermons at the same level, monotone across the board all the time? If that's the case, then what our ears do is they begin to tune out that frequency and we don't pay attention to it anymore. But if you're using inflections, you're keeping your volume up and down and you're moving through and you're matching that with the points of your sermon and what's going on. If you're doing that, if it's dynamic, then it's drawing people in, it's keeping their attention. It's keeping them engaged with what's going on because you're varying it up and you're switching up. We talk about all the time how attention span has just dwindled. And it's gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. And so what we see now, whether it's on TV or on Netflix or whatever, we see these really short videos. We see these 10-second videos and these 3-second videos and these 8-second videos because we know that people's attention are all over the place. Or what we do is when we're watching TV and commercials are broken up into shorter pieces, but then the segments of the show are broken up into shorter pieces. So we have, instead of at one point where we used to have like 8 to 10 minute segments, we have 3 to 4 minute segments, then a commercial, and then 3 or 4 segments, and then a commercial, because attention span is so short these days. Well, if you're not changing your approach, you're not changing your delivery for 20 minutes, well, people will start to tune that out. Even if what you're saying is interesting, they will still tune it out because there's not the up and down, there's not the inflections, it's not dynamic enough to keep their attention. And so your delivery has to have dynamics in it. And honestly, that just comes from practice. I used to stand in front of a mirror and practice. I would read portions of scripture at the mirror and use inflection points and use up and down and use my voice in different ways. Find ways to make your delivery more dynamic. So the first one is draw attention. Second one is dynamic delivery. The third one is visuals and atmosphere. And this goes back again to the stimulating the senses. When people walk into the sanctuary, are they walking into an atmosphere conducive for their reception of the sermon? Or is it the same sanctuary they've walked into 100 times? Because what I would say is the more that you can change up the room, the lighting, the decorations, the feel of the room. If you're going to have a dynamic, fast-paced, really energetic, hyper excited sermon, well, have bright lights and have even maybe moving lights or flashing lights, or create some sort of visuals in the room that say, hey, we're going to have a good time today. But if you're wanting to make a heartfelt impact, maybe the lights are lower, maybe there's some candles, maybe you're doing something in the room that's creating this atmosphere of, okay, we're going to have a heartfelt conversation today, and we're going to dig in deep to our hearts. Whatever it is, find ways to create an atmosphere with visuals, with sounds, again, even with smells. If you can do that, if you can get an air freshener that you just put in the room on those days that are a particular scent for the sermon, whatever you can do to create the atmosphere that they walk into. Because when they walk into a sanctuary that is set for the moment, then they're a lot more receptive. If you've ever been to a theater or you've ever been to a play and you walk into the theater, you walk through those doors into the actual area where the play is going to take place, the music is there, the sounds are there, the feel is there. You feel like, I know for me, one of the things I loved years ago is we did a play for the Gospel According to Scrooge. And we created the atmosphere. Once you walked into the theater, we had fake snow falling. We had really light Christmas music in the background. There were candles because our set was was the street, the Scrooge's street shops. And so when you walked into the room, you felt like you were there in that town just outside Ebenezer's shop, and you felt like you were a part. Now, obviously, that's way over the top, and that's for a play, not for a sermon every week. But what I'm saying is how are you creating the atmosphere that engages people and draws them in and helps them feel like they're about to experience something, not just sit through another sermon again? Okay? So draw attention, dynamic delivery, use visuals, and create an atmosphere. And the final one is practical application. Now, again, going back to our conversation last time, you're moving to preaching expository sermons. You're pulling large chunks of scripture and you're really bringing it to life and delivering that to take people deeper into their understanding of the Bible. But what can happen with that, if we're not careful, is that can detach the audience, the congregation, those hearing the sermon. You can detach them so far from them in scripture that they don't understand how it applies to their life. And I know for me, sometimes I get caught up in sharing all this wonderful material about the Bible and bringing the stories to life and really just kind of bringing the story of scripture to life, that sometimes it's hard for me, or I forget to really create a good application for the people who are hearing the sermon. When you create an application that they can take with them, so, hey, we talked about this portion of scripture. Here is God in the midst of that. Here are the takeaways from it. Here is how it applies to the people's lives in scripture, whether it's the Israelites or the disciples or whoever it is, the early church. This is how it applied to them, but this is how it applies to us. And this is how you can live this portion of scripture out today and tomorrow and throughout this week. This is how you can go deeper in your relationship with Jesus by using this practical application we learned today from this expository sermon, this large chunk of scripture that we're reading. Provide them with something they can walk away with and remember how to apply Scripture. Give them a practical application. And again, this is not always a strong suit of mine because I get caught up in the sermon itself and delivering the Scripture itself that I forget the practical application. And then people are like, man, that was a great sermon. I loved it. But I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do with that. And for me, that's a big miss because I did the first part really well and I missed the second part completely. Give them a practical application, because what's going to happen over time is you preach these dynamic, engaging, very visually stimulating sermons on Sunday. You give them a really practical, useful application on at the end of the sermon that they walk through the rest of the week and apply. Then what happens is they're going to see God moving in their life. They're going to see how Scripture informs how they live. And then when it comes back around to the next week, they're going to be looking for, what's the next thing that you're going to give me? What's the next application you're going to show me that I can apply this week and go even deeper with my relationship with God? And when you create that cycle of engaging sermons with great practical application that they live out throughout the rest of the week, and they see God move in a practical way, and they see how Scripture is tied to their everyday life, their desire for Scripture grows, their understanding of Scripture grows, their want to read more of Scripture grows, their perspective and understanding of God Himself grows, their relationship with Him grows, and they go deeper, not only in their relationship with God, but they go deeper in their understanding of Scripture. And that's the goal. That's where we want to be. We want to create sermons that engage them, but also sermons that engage them and give them practicality in their own life to apply it, that they can live it out. They can see that the Bible does apply to their lives today. And so those are the 4 things you can do: draw attention, dynamic delivery, visuals and atmosphere, and then give them a good practical application they can walk away with and really use throughout the course of the week and see God move in their lives. That is how you create an engaging sermon. That's how you get people to fall in love even more with Scripture, and how you can start building this deeper knowledge and foundation of the Bible and Scripture within your congregation, and engage them. So when they walk away from the Sunday morning sermon, they know that they've had an experience with Scripture, they've had an experience with God, and they fall in love with Him and the Bible even more than they have in the past. And that's where we really want to be. We want to help them really get to that place where they are hungry for more, and they keep diving in and diving in and diving in. That's the goal. So I hope this is helpful. I hope this is really helps you kind of see how you can take what you're already doing on a Sunday morning, what you're already doing with your sermons, how you can take that and tweak it and add to it and make it a little bit more engaging so people are drawn in and a part. And so I'm so glad that you're a part of this community. I'm so glad that you're here. And I really hope this is helpful for you and you're able to apply it even this week, even this week in the coming sermon that you're preparing. Really think through, how can I make this? How can I draw their attention more? How can I make it more dynamic in my delivery? How can I add? What visuals can I add to it that's going to create an atmosphere for people to be a part of? And then what's the practical application I can leave them with? You can do that this week, applying it to your sermon they're preparing right now, and just see if people are more engaged. Because I guarantee you, that's a big step, but I guarantee you do that consistently, people will be more engaged with what you're doing. They will keep coming back, and they will start to see the Scriptures live out in their lives. And that's what we want. And so I'm so glad you're here. So glad you're a part. I hope this is helpful. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next episode.